Snow fell softly on the Ardennes forest. It covered the tall pine trees in a white blanket. The air was cold. The world seemed quiet. American soldiers thought this was a ghost front, a place to rest. They were tired from months of hard fighting. They believed the war was winding down. They cleaned their rifles in quiet farmhouses. They wrote letters home, dreaming of a peaceful Christmas. The silence was a welcome friend, but this deep quiet was a lie. It was the stillness before a terrible storm. This was December 1944. A brutal surprise was waiting in the trees. On the other side of the forest, a massive German force gathered. Hitler had planned one last wild gamble. He called it Operation Watch on the Rhine. He believed he could smash a hole in the Allied lines. He wanted to drive his panzer divisions all the way to the port of Antwerp. This would split the American armies and the British armies. It might force the Allies to negotiate a peace. It was a desperate plan born from a desperate situation. The German war machine was failing. This was its final, furious roar. They would use the bad weather as a shield from Allied air power. The American lines in the Ardennes were thin. The soldiers there were new and untested, or weary veterans sent for a rest. Their commanders did not expect a major attack in this difficult terrain. The forest was dense. The roads were narrow and winding. The hills were steep. It was considered a poor place for a tank offensive. Intelligence reports that hinted at a German buildup were ignored or downplayed. The German assault began with a massive artillery barrage. The sound was deafening. Shells screamed through the dark, frozen air. They slammed into the American positions. The ground shook. Trees splintered and fell. Soldiers awoke to a world of fire and noise. Then, from the misty woods, the German infantry appeared. Then, from the misty woods, the tanks appeared. They moved forward through the snow, a gray tide of men and steel. The ambush was sprung. For the unprepared American soldiers, it was a sudden descent into chaos and terror. The German attack hit with shocking force. The American lines did not just bend. In many places, they shattered. Units were quickly cut off from each other. Radio communications went dead. The initial hours were a nightmare of confusion. Small groups of soldiers fought bravely, holding their ground in isolated foxholes, holding ground in villages. But the sheer weight of the German advance was overwhelming. Tanks rumbled down the narrow forest roads. The American soldiers were outnumbered and outgunned. They were forced into a desperate retreat through the deep snow. The cold was a constant enemy, biting at their faces and freezing their feet. The goal of the German spearhead was to move fast. They needed to seize key bridges and road junctions before the Allies could react. One unit, the Kampfgruppe Piper, was a powerful armored column. It pushed deep into the American lines. Along its path, it left a trail of destruction. It was during this drive that the infamous Malmedy massacre occurred. American prisoners of war were gathered in a field and machine-gunned by SS troops. This atrocity spread fear, but it also hardened American resolve. Soldiers who heard the news vowed they would not be taken alive. They would fight to the last man. The German offensive created a huge bulge in the Allied front line. This is how the battle got its famous name. The bulge on the map grew deeper each day. It stretched nearly 50 miles into the Allied-held territory. The situation looked grim. General Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, had to make a fast decision. He stopped all other offensive plans. He rushed reinforcements to the Ardennes. He ordered General Patton's Third Army to turn 90 degrees and attack the southern flank of the Bulge. It was an incredible logistical feat. Whole armies changed direction and moved to plug the gap. But getting those reinforcements to the front was a brutal challenge. The roads were clogged with retreating vehicles and terrified civilians. The weather was atrocious. A thick fog and low clouds kept the powerful Allied air forces grounded. This meant the soldiers on the ground had no air support. The German tanks and infantry could move without fear of being attacked from the sky. The first week of the battle belonged to the Germans. They had the surprise, they had the momentum, and they had the cover of the thick gray winter sky. The fate of the war in the West hung in the balance. It was not a large city, but it was a critical crossroads. 7 main roads met in the town. Whoever held Bastogne controlled the road network. Control the roads, and you control the speed of the attack. The Germans knew they had to capture it. The Allies knew they had to hold it. The American 101st Airborne, the Screaming Eagles, was rushed in. They were trucked in quickly, without their full equipment, missing winter clothing, missing heavy artillery, missing enough ammunition. The siege of Bastogne began. The town was completely cut off, surrounded by a ring of steel. Attack after attack followed. Tanks, artillery, infantry. Inside, the paratroopers dug in, from houses, from cellars, from frozen foxholes on the perimeter. The cold was relentless. Frostbite was as great a threat as enemy fire. Food was scarce. Medical supplies ran dangerously low. The wounded were treated in a makeshift aid station in a church. The defenders were outnumbered and isolated, but they refused to break. The German commander sent a formal demand for surrender to the Americans. The message was delivered to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. His official, one-word reply became one of the most famous quotes of the war. He sent a message back to the Germans that simply said, "Nuts." It was a clear and defiant refusal. The message lifted the morale of the exhausted defenders. They would hold Bastogne or die trying. For days, the siege continued. The sky remained cloudy, preventing Allied supply planes. The defenders scavenged for ammunition from destroyed tanks. They fought with grim determination in the biting cold. Then, on December 23rd, a Christmas miracle occurred. The clouds broke, the sun came out, the sky turned a brilliant, clear blue. The sound of airplane engines filled the air. C-47 transport planes appeared, parachutes loaded with food, medicine, and ammunition. The siege was not over, but hope had arrived from the sky. The clear skies changed everything, The clear skies changed everything, The clear skies changed everything, The sun that brought supplies to Bastogne also unleashed the full might of the Allied air forces. Fighter bombers, like the P-47 Thunderbolt, swarmed over the Ardennes. They were hunters in the sky. They roamed the roads, looking for German tanks and trucks. The German armored columns were now exposed and vulnerable. They had no place to hide in the snow-covered landscape. Allied pilots attacked them with machine guns, with bombs, with rockets. The German spearheads that had moved so fast were now being systematically destroyed from the air. The tide of the battle was beginning to turn. At the same time, on the ground, General Patton's Third Army was fighting its way north. His soldiers were engaged in a furious battle to break through the German lines and relieve Bastogne. It was a slow, brutal slog through the snow and ice. Every village and patch of woods had to be fought for. The Germans fought back fiercely, creating a wall of fire. But Patton's men pushed relentlessly forward. On December 26th, the day after Christmas, the lead tanks of the 4th Armored Division finally broke through. They linked up with the defenders of Bastogne. The siege was lifted. The German offensive had lost its momentum. Their plan depended on speed, but they were bogged down. They had failed to capture Bastogne. Their supply lines were being hammered from the air. Their tanks were running out of fuel. The element of surprise was long gone. Now they faced a massive Allied counterattack from the north and the south. The goal was to squeeze the Bulge and trap the German armies inside. The fighting was still incredibly intense. The winter weather remained brutal, but the strategic initiative had shifted back to the Allies for good. By the end of January 1945, the battle was over. The Bulge was gone. The front lines were back to where they had been before the attack began. The German gamble had failed. It was a costly failure. They had lost over 100,000 soldiers, killed, wounded, or captured. They had also lost hundreds of tanks and planes that they could not replace. The Allies also suffered heavy casualties, with the Americans taking the brunt of it. But the Allied war machine could replace its losses. The German army could not. The Battle of the Bulge had drained the last reserves of the Third Reich in the West. The Battle of the Bulge was not just a story of armies and maps. It was a story of individual human beings.